Hi, my name's Russell Sturgis. I'm the founder and principal of EAP Mentor, and welcome to the latest in our series of blogs on awareness and mindfulness. And in fact, this is today we're doing the fifth of a series on living life mindfully, where we've been looking at the principle of how to live with mindfulness. And of course, just touching back on things, mindfulness is remembering that you have a choice. And ultimately, a choice has to be created in most situations in order for you to be mindful. One is the awareness of your current way in which you're living life and the way that that's impacting. And the choice is what I'm referring to as a self-loving alternative, where there's a more loving way of being able to live life, where you are experiencing a greater sense of joy and inner peace, a greater sense of love and purpose, where that's a reality, where it's quite possible to have this experience in life that has you free of exhaustion and anxiety and fear and stress and scarcity and all the things that typically we experience when we're not in the place of being mindful. As I've mentioned before, my background is in alternative health, and I've spent many years working with people as a health practitioner. And one of the things that became very evident through the course of my career was that most people's problems were associated with exhaustion. People were tired, people were exhausted to their core. Even at a cellular level, there was exhaustion that was responsible for a lot of the lifestyle diseases and the symptoms that people were manifesting when they'd come to see me. This hasn't changed, and in fact I think it's got worse as time has gone on, and so consequently a greater need for an understanding of mindfulness and awareness. So as explained, we've talked about the whole idea of mindfulness being the recollection that you have a choice, and it's this idea that there's a choice between the way that you're living life in its exhausted state and the fact that there's an alternative, which is a healthy, vibrant, fulfilling expression of life that's with joy and love and all the things that we'd like to have, but I think for many of us we think are out of reach. Now, we talked about the importance of being over the series. We've talked about the importance of becoming more aware of the alternatives in order to have that choice, which is what mindfulness presents. Last blog we talked about the whole notion of following the path of least resistance, and this is this idea that you don't use will or determination in order to change your behaviours. If that worked, then people would only have to do diets once, and I've said this many times, but that's not the case, and many of you have probably related to this whole notion that you've probably done many diets and you've used a lot of will and determination. If that worked and worked alone, then people once would be enough, but that's not happening. So something else is required, and so the path of least resistance is this idea that we observe the choices and we already know the one that we're in, the reality with all of its challenges. This self-loving alternative is a new neural pathway, and as we gather information about it and how it's possible to get from where we're at to and creating strategies to get to that more self-loving alternative, we're developing neural pathways. And it's these neural pathways that as they expand, they have the capacity to shrink our old habits and programming. And so what happens is, as they expand, it creates less resistance within that neural electrical pathway, if you want to use that as an example. And so what happens is there's a point at which we start to adopt these more compassionate behaviours towards ourselves and others automatically. We don't have to use will or discipline, and we start to do things in a much more self-loving way, and we stop doing things that result in the stress and the burnout and all the things that we've experienced throughout our life's journey. So it is possible to make this change, and there's now a lot of scientific research that supports this whole notion of how new neural pathway development is able to create changed reality. The problem is that if you've tried to follow the path of least resistance, of course you have this natural tendency to want to go and pick up the chocolate and eat it, or pull out another cigarette and have it, or to go shopping, or whatever it is that is your habit that's become your program behaviour. And so the tendency is to want to keep on doing that, and as much as we create the self-loving alternative, sometimes it doesn't seem like that it can become established enough for it to become the path of least resistance. And so what we found at EAP is that in fact we need something that really helps to make a quantum shift, to turbocharge that shift from our program behaviours into a more self-loving reality. And how we do that is to become aware of what it is that creates our programming and habit in the first place. And at EAP we call that the story. We each have a story, which is a narrative that was established by the time we were 7 years of age, in most cases. And this narrative eventually, and we learn it by just observing, by watching and repeating. And so generally whoever was responsible for our program, who we spent most of our time with in our formative years, that's where these beliefs about ourselves and how we turn up in the world and how we're to behave and function have been established. And this becomes the basis of how we live our life and is the basis of the habits and programs that are responsible for us living from a fear base, that are responsible for us trying to either avoid or rise above those fears, and that often result in us experiencing exhaustion and burnout and all of the sorts of lifestyle diseases that are typical of a body that's been under constant stress. So in terms of creating sustainable change, besides the neural pathway concepts and developing the self-loving reality, what we also include is this notion of being able to identify the narrative, the story. And I write about that in this week's blog, so I'd encourage you to go and read the blog because it's a really lovely example of the way in which a story emerges and becomes the foundation of how someone lives their life, and consequently the challenges and the stressors that then present as a result of that. By identifying your narrative, and we've got a really lovely tool that we use in EAP to help people do that, and basically I can summarise it by saying is what we do is we have people identify what their core fear is, we have them identify a set of behaviours that they do to try and dodge that fear as best that they can, and we get them to summarise what those strategies for dodging the fear are, and ultimately those strategies are an intrinsic part of the story. The other part of the story is what is the thing that we're wanting most? What is the thing we're looking for? What I can tell you, it's some form of belief that we're okay. It's some form of sense that I'm lovable. And now we could use that, but it isn't sufficient because we each have our own belief about not being lovable. We each have our own narrative around that, and I think it's important that we understand our personal narrative. So in order to avoid what it is that we don't want, or to get what it is that we want, we have a set of strategies that we use to avoid the consequences of not having that which is our fear. So that's the basic formula. We take you through that in our 2-day workshops called the Pathway to Mindfulness workshops, and it's part of our Enhances Awareness program where we work with people one-on-one on a weekly basis over months to help create a much more loving reality where they're able to approach life without this narrative. In fact, we have a very delightful way of changing the narrative, and it's nothing like healing the wounded child. What we do, in fact, is help people see the gift that exists within their story. And in fact, a lot of the things that people do to avoid their fear, which is the foundation to their story, has had them become very skilled in a whole lot of areas. And it's about being able to take those skills and use them in a way that serves humanity and makes a difference in the world. And we call that your purpose. And so what we do is help people to find the gift in order for them to fulfill their purpose, to make a difference in the world. And when they're able to live their life knowing that in fact this story wasn't wasted, that there was something really quite amazing in it that was there for us to be able to turn up in the world in a much more profound and loving way, then it certainly makes it worthwhile to spend time becoming familiar with that whole notion that I have a narrative and a story and that I can change it. Next blog, I'll be talking about what it's like to live life where you're living it with a greater sense of mindfulness, in awareness, free of the narrative. And this is really the makings of living life in a place where there's a profound sense of worth and value and contribution, and therefore a clear sense of purpose. Anyway, thank you for listening today. Thank you for following our series. And so next week next blog, we'll have an opportunity to share more about what the experience of living life mindfully on a more consistent basis begins to look like. Anyway, we'll speak to you then. See you. Bye.